Well, welcome to another week's analysis behind the news. This week we're going to concentrate on one subject, and that is the war on Christianity. We see, for instance, our policies in the Middle East are really uprooting the Christian community. In Egypt, for instance, there are deaths, there are fire bombings of Christian churches, etc. About 10% of the population of Egypt are Christian. It was the same in Iraq as well. And we see now that they've been moving north, trying to get away from the various militants that are trying to obliterate all religion. There are those Muslims who don't like each other, the Shiites and the Sunnis, etc., etc. They kill each other. But the Christians, according to this article that appeared in the international section in the New York Times, they are exiting up north through Iraq and on into Turkey and then other parts of the world because it's become too dangerous for them to be there in Iraq anymore. And we see that the policies of our government all through the so-called Middle East have created this problem for Christians. Now, I have my personal belief is that this is part of the policies of the upper echelons of our own government. You can say, well, that's outrageous, that can't be, but things don't happen unless there's a purpose behind them happening. People make policy, they formulate policy, and then they get our armed forces and others to go out and do things that result in this sort of activity. Now, our men and women that have been sent to Iraq and Afghanistan and other areas, our flyboys over Libya, Libya, maybe Syria next, who knows, have caused these things to happen, but I don't think they're there for those purposes. They've been told they're there for other purposes. But what we see is a rising militancy in Islam. We see the Christians being forced out or killed in these areas because of our policies and everything else. Let me tell you how old this all is. One thing we see, for instance, in this morning's, or actually it's yesterday's obituaries from the New York Times, William Hamilton dies at 87, known for Death of God. It's got a little picture here of Time magazine some years ago, and on the cover it says, "Is God Dead?" And it says that it introduced the world to Mr. Hamilton, the Times article, the Time magazine article, as the leader of a new school of religious thinking it called the Death of God movement. Now, he really wasn't the new leader of the Death of God movement. The Death of God movement has been going on in this country for 200 years. I've been working on a book for years talking about the attack against the Constitution and against God in the United States since the inception of the United States up to the end of the Reconstruction period. Let me read you one little quote that I'm going to have in there. Richard Baird, in his book, Religion in America, published in 1856, exposes a great deal of the hardships Christianity suffered as a result of the war. Now, this is the War of Independence, most of which is unknown to today's Americans. Now, this is a quote from his book, 1856. Unfavorable to the promotion of religion, as were the whole 25 years from 1775 to 1800. In other words, unfavorable to the promotion of religion in that time period, 75 to 1800. The first spent in hostilities with England were preeminently so. In other words, the first half of the conflict were really against the promotion of religion. The effects of war on the churches of all communions were extensively and variously disastrous, to say nothing of the distraction of the mind from the subject of salvation. Its more palatable influences were seen and felt everywhere. Young men were called away from the seclusion and protection of the parental roof and away from the vicinity of the oracle of God to the demoralizing atmosphere of a camp. Congregations were sometimes entirely broken up. Churches were burned or converted into barracks or hospitals by one or other of the belligerent armies. In other words, both the English and the American. Often by both successfully. In more than one instant, pastors were murdered. The usual ministerial intercourse was interrupted. Efforts for the dissemination of the gospel were, in a great measure, suspended. Colleges and other seminaries of learning were closed for want of students and professors. And the public morals in various respects, and in almost all possible ways, deteriorated. Christianity is a religion of peace, and the tempest of war never fails to blast and scatter the leaves of the tree which was planted for the healing of the nations. Let me read that last sentence. Christianity is a religion of peace, and the tempest of war never fails to blast and scatter the leaves of the tree which was planting for the healing of the nations. Now, this is a book written in 1856 about the problems that occurred between 1775 and 1800 relative to Christianity in our country. In 1794, Elihu Palmer formed what was known as the Theistical Society in New York. And he did that, organized it among a number of enthusiasts for the French Revolution. And it was actually nicknamed the Columbian Illuminati. The Columbian Illuminati. And so this was one of the first organized attempts to promote what we would call today atheism. There were others. There was Cooper. Thomas Paine was even involved in this sort of thing. I know Thomas Paine in your history books is a very nice guy, and Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, very good. After that, you should call the man in question, because he became very, very much an enemy of God. In fact, it was well known in his day when he finally came back to the United States after sojourning in England, had to flee there and go into France, was jailed there, finally came back to the United States. He didn't have very many friends other than the types of individuals in this theistical society in New York, a bunch of atheists. And then I'll throw out another name for you too in American history that we were all taught, myself included, in school about this wonderful man and his influence on American thinking and how wonderful this influence was and everything else. And I must say that his poetry is wonderful. I do like a lot of it. But I'm talking about Ralph Waldo Emerson. By 1848, he left the ministry and became the Death of God leader in American theological circles. He and his followers ultimately changed the Unitarian Church into what it is today. At first, the Unitarian Church was a Christian church. You cannot say that today about the Unitarian Church. There are people that sit in the congregation and don't even believe in God. But at any rate, by 1848, he had left the ministry and had evolved into this thing. I've been to the statue that spans the creek there, where the Patriots, the militia, stopped the English right after Lexington and Concord, and they started their disastrous retreat back to Boston. And it was the shot heard round the world, as they say. But the militia stopped the English at that bridge. And at that Concord Bridge, there's a statue to the Minutemen. Stirring words on there by Ralph Waldo Emerson. They just really tug at your heart. But the problem is, it's not so much what he did in the way of poetry as what he did with his essays and what he did behind the scenes organizing the movement against God. It's an ongoing problem in this country. It permeates all of government. We see it manifested in the various things about getting prayer out of the schools, not acknowledging God unless it's Allah or Buddha or something of that nature. But Christianity, no, that is verboten. So what we see is that these official policies of the government are anti-Christian in our schools and at home. Now let's go right back to the point we opened up with in this particular segment. And that is, if they're doing it at home, what do you think they're doing in the Middle East? Till next week, we'll see you then.